This program is brought to you by the University of California, Davis on iTunes U. For more information, please visit us at itunes.ucdavis.edu.
Okay, folks, welcome to this debate.
As I was saying,
which I will try and keep order between our two contenders here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time singing their praises. They're both extremely well known in the fields of macroeconomics. And though we have this interesting past where they disagree violently about the potential of any stimulus policy for changing the level of employment in the economy. The rules of engagement are going to be that each will have 12 minutes and 12 minutes only to present their opening case. Then we'll actually have them debate for another 20 or 30 minutes with each other. Then some of the distinguished UC Davis economics faculty will get a chance to question them. So we'll have 5 questioners. And then, if I've done my job, there's actually a microphone here, and some of the public or others can get to come to the microphone. And then all I have technologically to aid me in this task is the following. So, without further ado, Brad DeLong will now defend the Obama stimulus.
Well, guess I should start by saying I'm still bemused to be here. We are here because Professor Boldrin is one of the signatories to the Cato Institute's large advertisements supporting the proposition that, quote, it is a triumph of hope over experience to believe that more government spending will help the U.S. today. And I am bemused because I was told nearly 30 years ago in a course I took with Greg by our then teacher Barry Eichengreen that that view had been exploded in the 1920s, that it had been 70 years since anyone serious believed that fiscal policy was ineffective at boosting an economy. Now, back at the start of this decade, the Republican politicians for whom the Cato Institute is carrying water when it pays for full-page ads, they believed as much as anybody that deficit spending would spur employment and production. It was one of the big arguments they made for the 2001-2003 Bush budgets. Now it's 2009, and somehow things have become very different. It's a certain Orwellian quality here, when arguments are made now that would have been very relevant 5 years ago, but were totally dropped then. Now the argument that Professor Boldrin is making appears, I think, in compressed form in an article he wrote for the Denver Post a couple weeks ago. That fiscal stimuli either do not work or work too slowly. Is there a case for government borrowing now to finance a stimulus package? People are worried about the future and are sensibly reducing their spending. Does this imply the government should step on and do the spending for them? Put that way, the idea seems like a non-starter. If we are poorer, so is our government. This is, if I have read it correctly, an argument that historians of economic thought call Say's law, that spending is falling and employment is falling like a stone now, not because there is too little demand for existing supply, but because rather we are now poorer and ought to be spending less and supplying less. If the government tries to fix this by spending more, it must first borrow or confiscate the resources to pay for its spending by somebody else, and that somebody else must then cut back on their spending by an equal amount. Now, anyone who can use their eyes can see that this Say's law is in general false. Recall 2003 to 2006, when America's home builders spent money building a lot of extra houses. The American unemployment rate fell from 6 to 4.8%. Recall 1996 to 2000, when the assembled investors and businesses of America discovered the internet and in response upped their spending on computer and communications. The American unemployment rate fell from 5.6 to 4.3%. In general, spending works to spur the economy, and the government's money, when spent, is as good as anybody else's. Now, just because deficit spending spurs employment and production does not mean we should always be doing it or always doing more of it. There are, I believe, 5 good economic arguments against stimulus packages in general, and if we have time at the end, I'll go into why none of them seem to apply right now. But right now I want to focus on the much more important, very basic point. The Cato Institute claim, endorsed by Professor Boldrin, that deficit spending will be ineffective, not unwise, ineffective at boosting employment and production is false. The argument that deficit spending cannot work because in order to spend you had to borrow, and then the person from whom you borrowed must spend less, sounds good at first, but it is wrong. To see why it is wrong, let me give the microphone to right-wing libertarian economist and Chicago School founder Milton Friedman, who is no longer with us, but his words, his wisdom, his influence live on. And here is the argument Friedman made in 1972 for the power of fiscal policy with signs reversed. Friedman then was talking about cutting rather than expanding deficit spending. What Friedman said was, quote, if extra government spending is not financed by higher taxes, the government would have to borrow more. The individuals from whom the government borrowed now have less left to spend on themselves. But to find any net effect on spending, one must look further beneath the surface. As the government borrows more, interest rates rise and make it more expensive for people to hold cash. Hence, some of the funds borrowed by the federal government are subtracted from idle cash balances, rather than taking from money that was going to be spent or loaned. Now, Friedman did not in general like deficit spending. He was perhaps the foremost advocate of the belief that monetary policy by the Federal Reserve is almost always superior as a stabilization policy tool. Friedman believed fiscal policy was a weak reed, that its effects were, quote, certain to be temporary and likely to be minor, but weak does not mean powerless, and almost always does not mean always. The answer to the question Friedman would ask, why not do monetary policy instead, is we are doing monetary policy too. We are, in fact, doing as much expansionary monetary policy right now as we possibly can. But we do not think it is enough to keep us out of a depression. We are in that unusual case in which the difference between almost always and always actually matters. The last time the United States was in such a case was back in the 1930s. And back in 1972, Friedman favorably cited his old teacher Jacob Weiner's advice as to what to do in the Great Depression. Weiner wrote, quote, government and Federal Reserve expansionary bank operations have not nearly sufficed to cure the economy. The simplest and least objectionable procedure would now be for the federal government to increase its expenditure or to decrease its taxes and to finance the resultant excess of expenditure over tax revenues either by printing legal tender greenbacks or by borrowing from the banks. Now, if you want to maintain that deficit spending will be ineffective at boosting employment and production, you must first maintain that you know more and better about monetary economics than Milton Friedman did, and you must also explain why it is that Friedman got such a key issue wrong, why it is that Friedman, who had no love for government, and to whom Grover Norquist, who merely wanted to drown the government in a bathtub, was a dangerous left-winger, why Friedman nevertheless believed that fiscal policy could be effective. Now, when I listened to Professor Boldrin on the radio yesterday, he appeared to be a very strong advocate of what my old teacher Walter Salant called the We Must Suffer caucus. You know, what I tend to call, after its 3 most illustrious members, the Karl Marx, Herbert Hoover, Friedrich Hayek axis. Right, again from the Denver Post, quote, the greatest problem with the bailouts has been the lack of willingness to make those responsible be responsible. CEOs who bankrupted their firms get to keep their jobs. State governments that get sent irresponsibility get bailed out with no strings attached. So that's not the American way. And it is indeed true that we have had mammoth failures of moral hazard and of market functioning in the financial markets, and we need to fix them. But we have a broken financial system. We need to fix the broken financial system. But right now we have something worse. We have a broken financial system and we have the threat of massive unemployment. We can fix the broken financial system without having to have massive unemployment if we use the government temporarily as a spender of last resort to keep employment high, while Tim Geithner and his understaffed group of crazed, sleepless bureaucrats in the Treasury Department try to fix, right, the financial system. The argument that we have to fix the financial system is a correct one. The argument that therefore we have to let unemployment rise painfully and tightly is wrong. Now, you can say that we need to move a lot of people out of one set of industries and into another to repair what is now a maldistribution of employment. But we don't have to say that the inevitable price of that has to be a period of high unemployment, why we do the move. Professor Boldrin's co-author or fellow co-signer, John Cochrane of Chicago, has been said, quote, we should have a deep recession, that people who have spent their lives pounding nails in Nevada recently need something else to do. And Paul Krugman has, I think, what is a decisive answer to this Marx, Hoover, Hayek belief that we must suffer, or rather not we, because we tenured college professors keep our jobs, and in fact consumer prices fall a little bit, so our purchasing power is likely to rise. It's the little people, the construction, the manufacturing, the service sector workers of America, who are the people whose lost jobs are that big downward line at the end of the graph. What Krugman writes is the basic idea of the Marx-Hoover-Hayek axis is that a recession, even a depression, is somehow a necessary adapting to the structure of production. We have to get those people who are pounding nails in Nevada into other places and occupations. The trouble is that we didn't need to have a period of high unemployment to get those people into the nail pounding in Nevada business. So why must we endure a period of high unemployment when we want to get them out? And why do recessions reduce unemployment across the board, not just in industries that were bloated by the bubble? The current slump is affecting non-housing bubble states as or more severely as it is affecting the epicenters of the housing bubble. The depression is the necessary price we must pay for sectoral readjustment theory, right? It simply does not work as an intellectual enterprise. It works only when production of investment goods shrinks. It doesn't work when production of consumption goods shrink. Something else is going on. There's no reason why we can't use the government as a demander to cushion the fall in unemployment, even though fiscal policy is useless for dealing with the problems in the financial system. Now, Professor Boldrin is following a very old trail. Right? His trail was, in fact, the ruling theory behind the Hoover administration's policies in the 1930s. And to quote from President Herbert Hoover's autobiography, during his administration, economic policy was made by, quote, the leave-it-alone liquidationists, headed by my Secretary of the Treasury, Mellon, who felt the government must keep its hands off the economy and let the slump liquidate itself. Mr. Mellon had only one formula: liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers, liquidate real estate. He insisted that when the people get a bubble brainstorm, the only way to get out of their blood is to let it collapse. He held that even a full-fledged panic was not altogether a bad thing. He said, it will purge the rottenness out of the system. High costs of living and high living will come down. People will work harder, live a more moral life. Values will be adjusted, and enterprising people will pick up the wrecks from less competent people. In the same piece I quoted above, Milton Friedman had a number of very harsh things to say about Professor Boldrin's predecessors, whom Friedman says were centered at the London School of Economics, where the dominant view was indeed that the Depression was an inevitable result of the prior speculative boom, that the only sound policy was to let the Depression run its course. This London School, really Austrian view, I referred to, Friedman says, as, quote, the atrophied and rigid caricature of the quantity theory of money that is so frequently described by the proponents of the new income expenditure approach, and with some justice. He and his teachers at the University of Chicago, Friedman goes on to say, had never believed in such dangerous nonsense. And I'm out of time.
Thank you. Okay, Professor Boldrin, do you have much to agree with this?
Well, I'm glad to be here, and thanks for the invitation. I didn't know I was here to represent all the people Brad mentioned, most of which I don't know, and I don't represent. I'm here to represent my point of view. So let me avoid making the mistake that it's often made of starting to argue on the territory and on terrain and field that your debater has chosen for you by putting words in your mouth. So let me tell you what I think about the facts and the crisis and what should be done. But before doing that, and I will have time later to correct the plenty of factual mistakes contained in Bradford introduction, let me just show you this little graph. It's a map of the United States available, you probably noticed, on the New York Times online. The darker areas are the areas where the unemployment is growing rapidly. The lighter areas are those in which unemployment is growing less. Anybody that has any knowledge of how the price of housing and the housing bubble has been moving around the country may notice a very strong correspondence between the areas and the counties where unemployment is growing and the areas where, in fact, the housing bubble was stronger. So much for that fact. But that was not my point. So let me give you some of my thoughts. Let's start with a few facts, I guess we can agree. What did happen during the last year or two? A clear asset inflation that we like to call bubble ended. The asset inflation did not have to do only with housing prices. If you take a look at any stock market index, you will realize that in the period that goes from roughly 2001, 2002 to the peak, indices such as the S&P 500 have grown more, no less, than Case-Shiller index of average housing price. In fact, there is only one Case-Shiller index, the Case-Shiller 10, the one for the 10 big metropolitan area, that has grown during that period at a percentage, that's about 82, 83%, comparable to the S&P 500. So there's been a general asset inflation. They're all coming down. We'll discuss later why. What this certainly means, whatever the reason for that coming down, is a dramatic drop in wealth. I'm going to argue that that dramatic drop in wealth is, at least for now, the main source of the dramatic drop in demand we are observing. I'm going to also try to show you some data and facts to convince you that a huge chunk of the GNP we thought we have produced in the past few years, we only thought. We didn't, implying that we are de facto poorer than we like to think, and we better cope with that, which does not imply any masochistic or suffering policy. It purely implies we should face the fact. Our third fact, on which there seems to be no discussion, is that our financial sector is in shambles and is in a serious crisis. It's not functioning, and this is causing a serious credit crunch. We'll see the implication of that for aggregate demand and its composition. Finally, and this also, to me, is pretty self-evident, but maybe it's less evident from available data, the composition of our output, that is what we can produce with a given capacity, with a given labor force, its specialization, and so on, seems to be highly incompatible with the composition of the aggregate demand we're facing in this moment. And there is an issue there, or either moving demand where output is, or moving output where demand is, or moving prices, or something in between. Those are the facts. Demand. Where did a big increase in demand come from in the last, say, 6-7 years? And here I have in mind the period 2001-2007. A large extra amount of demand came from equity extraction from homes, which has been growing as a percentage of net housing value, and it doubled between 2001 and 2005. I use it 2005 because it was actually the peak of the housing price. The cash equity extraction grew by a factor of 4 in those years. Most of this came from equity lines and refinancing. You want to know where the drop in demand came from? Here it is. On the left, you have the percent equity extraction without selling home from 95 to the peak on March 11 of 2007, and then the subsequent drop of equity extraction. On the right, you have the net extraction from real estate holding. In this graph, you can actually see the percentage of that cash which has been used for debt repayment and consumption. The pink, I guess, line is the one that goes directly in consumption. You want to know where the drop in demand comes from? It comes from there. Houses being worth less, the getting into debt by extracting equity that the American household has been used abundantly during the last years is gone. There is no money for demand. The demand is gone. The GNP we thought we produce, not only we are producing less GNP because of the raising unemployment. The point is that if you do your income accounting, national income accounting right, you realize that actually there is a chunk of PhD we thought we had produced, which we didn't. Think of the way in which you compute the value out of the construction sector. Well, you multiply the number of houses you produce by their price. Well, the price is some base here, and then it's a chain index that get adjusted over time. Now, yes, indeed, we did produce houses, but the value of those houses that we used to impute it in our computation of GNP was just not the one we thought it was in 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005, 2006, 2007. It was a lot less. Let's think of the value out of the financial sector, which happens to be 14% of corporate value added in 2007, and similar percentages rising for about 10% in 2001. How much of that value was added? That is, what is that sector produce that should correspond to bread and butter and shoes and cars, and that should be actually part of the national wealth. In particular, let's look at the capital income of the financial sector, which was about 28% of the total capital income of the whole corporate sector in 2007. What was that income? Was that income produced, or was it just capital taken away and consumed? In case you want to have a graphical representation, you can look at this. The orange line on the bottom gives you from 1952 to 2006, the ratio of capital income in the financial sector, financial corporate sector, as a percentage of value added in that sector. As you may notice, that percentage grows dramatically since 94-95, reaching a level of 16%, which is historically absolutely unprecedented. The question is, that stuff we thought it was income, it was nothing. Credit crunch. Where is the thing? Just a little graph to understand what credit crunch means for the drop in demand, what's causing the drop in demand. What you have here, these are data from Federal Reserve System, calls on banks. The way you want to interpret those lines, there are various recessions that goes back from 1979 to now. You want to look at the rightmost upper part there. The blue line is computed by using the call reports from all banks that have increased their credits. They have increased their loans during the period. So when it goes up, it means positive. Loans are increasing. When it goes down, it means they are decreasing. The red line is the opposite. The red line is the number of banks that have been cutting down credits. So when that red line goes down, meaning there are fewer banks cutting loans. When that red line goes up, there are more banks cutting loans. You can see quite clearly what those two lines have been doing since the third quarter of 2007. You're wondering why people are reducing their consumption, reducing their demand of a variety of goods, in particular durable goods. The answer is in that graph. This we'll use later if we need to get into the details. So those are the facts, those are some of the basic facts I like to think about. Brad has attributed to me a number of theories, some of which I didn't know the existence before. So I'm not going to debate about those theories. Let me actually tell you something else. How many minutes do I have, Greg? I don't want to get you. Do we have models, do we have tools right now that will allow us to think at those facts and interpret them in any credible way? My impression is that we don't. We barely have a little sketch of the model, the third one in the line. The other two we can throw into the garbage can. In particular, what we can clearly throw in the garbage can is this pseudo-eternal Keynesian neo-new, post, after, above, below, in the middle, transversal, diagonal, always coming out, which has always one funny ingredient, actually two. The funny ingredient is price is sticky. Prices are sticky. I thought this whole mess was due to the fact that the damn prices are the opposite than sticky. They're going down like rocks. So what the hell am I going to do with that model? And on top of that, that beautiful model tells me that you know why you have a drop in demand? You don't have a drop in demand because the value of houses are gone. You don't have a drop in demand because people cannot take out equities. You don't have a drop in demand because there is a credit crunch. You have a drop in demand because consumer had a preference shock. They just woke up one morning and said, hell, I don't feel like consuming anymore. I'd rather go fishing with my friend Larry Jones. Technology shock. I suppose you were waiting for some Minnesota clone of Ed Prescott. Ed is a nice guy. And I love him a lot, especially when we're having beers. But no, I'm not his clone. RBC model in this whole story, can't tell us zip. I saw no technology shock. I don't know what they can explain me. They might explain other episodes. They're not going to explain this one. Create a financial accelerator. We'll go back to that because I don't want to get over time. There is something there. As you may notice, I'm hinting with my data on the credit crunch. I think there is something there we should focus upon. This may be useful. Let me stop here. 1 minute? Okay. So these are the facts. These are the models that were available. Not a lot. My suggestion and my position, borrowing what I have written, actually, not what Brad has attributed me, but what I've actually written and signed, is that we should think hard to what we're facing because it's not really something we understand clearly. We don't have the tools. And our reach, kind of Pavlovian dog reaching for the automatic pistol in front of the banana or whatever bone is wagging in front of us, it's not a good solution. I don't like the idea of just saying, well, you know, I always said public spending. Let's do public spending too, right? Isn't that what you do when you are in a crisis? I don't know. I'm not advocating some painful future. I'm saying, look, there is no quick and painless fix of the mess we're in. And if we want to make it less painful and shorter, we may want to spend some time thinking harder at what we're doing. We also should not deny the fact that we wasted 2 precious years at the policy level pretending that the problem was not as serious as it was, and therefore creating substantial panic in the market, in the public, and around the world. I'm going to do it now. and insisting on a politics of fear that we seem to be doing these days too, when we say, look, we have to do something, absolutely something immediately, otherwise the world is coming apart. Hold it. Maybe the world is coming apart, but doing things in a hurry, typically, when you are in troubles, maybe like rock climbing, like I was showing you before, it's actually even more dangerous. So hold on a second. Let's try to make this debate useful. Let's talk about what we actually said, not what somebody else, Mr. Hoover or Mr. Friedman, whoever they were, said. And let's move on.
Thank you. Hold on. Okay, folks, now let's just alternate with 5 minutes for each side. And Brad, over to you.
I don't think I'll need 5 minutes.
Microphone.
Well, first of all, I can't on the fly produce a graph with degree of housing bubble overvaluation on the horizontal axis and rise in unemployment over the past year on the vertical axis. I don't have it here. If I had it here, it would show a cloud with an extremely low correlation. Here are some numbers as to how much unemployment has in fact risen over the past year in a bunch of different states, ranked by states, with the rightmost column being the rise in unemployment. North Carolina, Indiana, Idaho, Oregon, Georgia, South Carolina, Michigan, Alabama, Tennessee. Those aren't big housing bubble states. Rhode Island, Nevada, Florida, California, those are. What's happened has gone well beyond, right, the end of overconstruction in the housing sector. What's happened has gone well beyond, the financial distress that originally gummed up the works. We face something more serious and significant, and we should deal with the thing that's more serious and significant rather than spend all our time worrying about what's happening to in the financial sector. And I won't take 5 minutes because unless I'm wrong, Professor Boldrin did not say a single word for what I was told he was going to say on the debate, right? That I was told I was going to come here because Greg wanted me to debate someone who believed that the Obama administration fiscal stimulus was going to be ineffective, that it was not going to boost employment and production, that we shouldn't try to halt this screaming downward collapse of employment in the American economy by having the government spend money, on the grounds that in the past there's a bunch of empirical regularities suggesting that whenever any one particular group in the economy gets through its head that it ought to be spending a bunch more money, that employment goes up, production goes up, and unemployment goes down. And it seems reasonable to presume that the government's money is as good as anyone's. Now, given what Professor Boldrin had written on it, and given what the other signatories of the big Cato letter said, I presumed that he was going to make an argument for why the stimulus program would be ineffective, but he didn't.
Brad, thank you.
I did. I showed you the symptoms of the disease, and now I'm asking you which one of those symptoms, which one of those causes of disease will building new school building in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where 15 of them are empty, help us? Oh. In what sense will making rural Nebraska wireless help us solve the inability of consumer and household across the United States to withdraw cash and borrow cash from their real estate equities, help us, and so on and so forth? I showed you the disease. Easy. I showed you the disease. I said, I'm not sure I have the cure ready. I have some hints. If we want, we can go and talk about it. What I know for sure is that this quick fix that you have in mind ain't going to fix that for sure. So I did talk about what I was supposed to come here and talk. I said, by showing what the problem is. If we want to talk about the real problem we are facing and its causes and the way it's manifesting itself in the economy, I'm happy to do it. If we want to repeat litanies, is that the way you say litania in English? Right? And religious principles, go ahead. I don't have any particular religion to attach myself, so I'm not very interested in a debate of ideologies. I'm interested in what happened.
It will put people back to work.
Which people?
It will keep them from losing their jobs.
Really? Do you think that spending money... So let's get one thing straight here. Let's get one thing straight here. Let's get one thing straight here. I didn't say, I didn't sign it, nor I ever wrote that in fact, in the Denver Post thing with David Levine, we made very clear that some aspects, for example, the extension of unemployment benefits of the spending bill, are fine with us. And so are by the others, like, spending on some education stuff. I have doubts on the particular actual for we want to do the health spending, but they're technical doubts. I'm not going to debate much. So the issue is not with the general validity of some... Let me finish. With the general validity of some of the spending. The issue is, are they useful to attack the crisis per se, or are they useful for something else? If Mr. Obama, if President Obama wants to use the crisis and the dramatic situation with it to pursue some of the policies for which he was elected, that's fine, but what he should do is say, I'm pursuing the policy for which I was elected. Then there is the crisis, let's attack the crisis with specific medicine. The two things ought to be separated. What I am quarreling against is the illusion we are selling the American people, which in my opinion is extremely dangerous because it's completely similar to the illusion that the Bush administration sold in 2001 after September 11, that by doing this radical, dramatic, last-moment spending measure now and lowering interest rate at dramatically ridiculous level back then, we are actually solving the problem. We are not. That's the problem. That's what I'm taking issue at. Those are not answers to the problem we are facing. The answer is to something else. If you want, we debate that. But I see no way in which increasing spending in Medicare and Medicaid, which means hiring more nurses or paying nurses more, because the supply of nurses ain't going to grow overnight, and I'm sorry, those guys, using the hammer on the nails in Nevada are not going to become nurses in the hospital of the United States as we increase spending on health care. We're not solving their unemployment problem of the nail guys. We're just maybe increasing the demand for nurses. But then it will take the time to turn the construction worker with their big, thick hands into nurses.
Well, it seems to me that you shouldn't have signed the Cato Institute letter.
Let me judge that.
No, if your disagreements with that are of the magnitude that you just said. And it seems to me that you're misrepresenting the Obama administration's position quite remarkably right now. That if you go and if you talk to Barack Obama, if you talk to Tim Geithner, if you talk to Larry Summers, and if you ask them, does the stimulus package fix the problems in the financial system? They say, of course not. They say the idea of the stimulus package is to have the government act as spender and demander of last resort so that the problems of the financial system don't manifest themselves in an unemployment rate that gets above 10%, as well as all the other problems, right, that they're creating. To say that we shouldn't do fiscal policy now because it won't fix the problem is like saying that if someone's artery has been cut, you shouldn't apply pressure and put a bandage on the wound because that's not how you sew back up the artery. And the answer is yes, after the patient's stabilized, you do need to fix the fundamental problem. But first of all, for God's sake, put a bandage on it. And don't sit around watching them bleed to death saying, oh, well, putting a bandage on it won't deal with the fundamental problem. And, no, it's...
It's very simple, Brad. You're missing the point. I mean, you're very good. You must have belonged to some debate society, but allegories, metaphors, the sick guy, we can come up with plenty of them, and they're not going to cut cheese. I thought you were not a macroeconomist. It seems you are a macroeconomist, whereas, thanks Lord, I'm not. I'm a student of a guy that used to do general equilibrium theory. You suffer the classical macro fallacy that you share with my old friend Ed Prescott. You guys just think aggregate, national income accounting aggregate. You don't understand that there is not spending, generic spending. There is spending in something. And when I demand a certain good, in the short run, whereas in the short run is 6 months to a year, I'm demanding that good and I'm increasing demand for that good, which does not mean I'm increasing general unemployment. Employment. I'm increasing employment of the guys that produce that good. So if the guys that are being fired are the construction workers, are the agricultural workers, are the real estate agents, are the guys in the financial sector that worked on that, that's where the unemployment is coming up, first and foremost. Or the car sector, the durable goods sector. And if I want to solve that, that's where it's bleeding, according to you, right? Well, very good. If that's where it's bleeding, that's the stuff we should buy. So if the stimulus package had to be effective for the bleeding, for the dramatic, immediate bleeding, it should contain purchase of SUV vehicles from General Motors, purchase of houses in Nevada, purchase of repair work in southern Florida, in the Tampa area, and so on and so forth. There, it's bleeding. Not somewhere else. The macro fallacy is a dramatic mistake of all macroeconomists that don't understand general equilibrium theory and relative prices. They don't understand that it's not true that you turn a metal worker into a nurse, in a computer programmer, in a farmer, or whatever you want overnight just because the public spending is doing that. You don't. You don't. It's called human capital with a big word. It's called skills. It's called regional distribution of the unemployment. If you want to stop the bleeding, you don't. If the guy has a broken nose, you don't put a Band-Aid on his butt.
Brad.
Oh, no. I think if you go and if you find any labor economist, they will say that the American workforce is much, much, much more flexible than you imagine. I know that the people who are now renovating my bathroom back in Greater San Francisco, that one of them was 2 months ago a janitor at a local Kaiser medical facility. That people switch industries, switch jobs, switch occupations all the time. We can put a huge number of people to work building schools who were construction workers, and we'll put some people to work building schools who weren't construction workers before, and we'll have a whole bunch of construction workers people who were in the past construction workers who will be able to find other jobs. to take a look at what's happened to our employment and saying, oh, we can't do anything about it because all of the 5 million people who've lost their jobs in the past year can't find anything to do because they're only qualified to do the one job they were doing 2 years ago, completely misses the fact that half of them weren't even in that industry, right, 3 years before. If you say that macroeconomists suffer from the aggregate fallacy, and I will strongly deny that I'm a macroeconomist. I'm an economic historian. We look at patterns. We look at patterns from the past and try to say what kinds of empirical regularities are there out there and what kind of theories might account for them, rather than what macroeconomists do, which is start from a whole set of theoretical assumptions and derive an unlikely and inapplicable model.
Well, so let's get to the point here. So you claim that labor mobility, intersectional labor mobility, is super quick. I assume there is some. I wish I had the time to go on the web and find the plentiful of econometric jobs and research that
you
prove
might try Blanchard and Katz in their study of the 1991. Look at Blanchard and Katz's 1991 Brookings paper about the local recession in Los Angeles.
Pull it up, Brad. Pull it up. Just while I talk, just go on JSTOR. I think Brookings is there. Go to the Brookings page, pull them up, and we'll see if the reasonable estimate we have available suggests that we should expect the construction workers of Nevada to be moving somewhere else, or even Nevada itself, and become nurses anytime soon during 2009. Okay? Let's try to see that. That's one point. At this point, it's down to the data. We got plenty of economists here. My statement is the intersection mobility of labor, while it may be high, it's not nearly as high as the one you're pretending, would probably produce no effect in the interval of time we're talking about, which is now 12 months from now. That's what we're talking about. In the meanwhile, and I want to go back to that later, the problems I was representing and trying to describe before will remain. As for economic history, let's go and look at all the recent experience of increasing government spending in front of situation of serious crisis, depression, and so on. Japan is here for you to judge. The line going up is spending as a percent of GNP, public spending. The line going down is the Nikkei. And let me get you a better one so we can look at all the G7 countries, talking about historical evidence. Come on, baby, come up. Otherwise, my time is on. So what you have here, can you see these graphs? I didn't have time to make them bigger. So the red line, so these are for the G7 countries, so it's 6 of them over United States. The red line is the percentage of public spending, in the level of public spending in that country divided the United States one. The blue one is GNP. If public spending increases in one country should generate an increase in GNP, you would expect that when the red line goes up, the blue line also goes up and vice versa. You can see what happens with France. It goes up, the GNP during... No, you don't understand.
Later for the audience.
Okay, let me explain what this is. The red line is public spending. They're both, the red line is public spending, the blue line is GNP. The red line is public spending in France over public spending in the United States. So when that red line goes up, it means public spending in France is growing a lot faster than public spending in the United States. When the blue line goes up, it means GNP in France is growing faster than in the United States. So I would expect, I repeat, if public spending helps to boost growth, I would expect the two lines to co-move. When the red goes up, the blue goes up. So that's France. This is Canada. This is my beautiful country, Italy. Let me get the others. This is Germany. This is Japan. How beautiful. Did I do them all, or I have forgotten somebody? I don't want to offend any country. I think they're all there. So that's for the historical evidence. We can go on with historical evidence. I think I have a few more here in the little thing that I had prepared beside Japan. Oh, estimate. Yes, this is also very interesting. There's plenty of studies of people that have used various econometrics techniques for which notoriously, and on that side I'm with my friend at Prescott, I don't have a particular sympathy, and I don't trust them very much. But there is plenty of people that believe by doing some regression, some VARs and this and that, you actually measure actual causality. Montfort and Uhlig is the last one that has been collecting and and serving all these results. And here is their finding. Their finding is, Jesus, I'll show you in the next one because I don't want to consume time. Their finding is exactly the same as the one from my graphs. Public spending as a multiplier, which is lower than 1 even in the short run. Deficit spending in particular as a small multiplier. Funny enough, what is that they find? That the only public deficit spending that has a decent multiplier is tax cuts. That's the data. Then there are opinions, then there are religions, then there are litanies.
Brad. I think Valerie Ramey at UCSD would disagree. Would say that her best estimate of the multiplier is 1.5. And Christy Romer would say that Valerie Ramey's estimates, although she's tried very hard to clean them, are still contaminated by a bunch of omitted variable biases. And she and her husband David have been arguing with us at Berkeley for the past 2 years that the spending multiplier is considerably bigger, that if you kind of boost the government deficit by $1, you're going to get back $3 of extra spending and an associated $3 of spending worth of reduced unemployment, right, as a result. I think that they've thought about this for quite a while and worked very hard at it and are highly competent and have significant trust in what Romer and Ramey are doing. Now, if you want to reject that, and I suppose you can, I simply want to retreat to the broader historical correlations and simply say that whenever you have a spending boom by any group, right, within the society, then we see the unemployment rate go down and economic growth go up. And to say that the hypothesis that the right thing to do now to keep the unemployment rate from rising a lot is to try and see if the government's money is as good as anyone else is a highly reasonable and intelligent thing to do, and a very good thing to do, right? There are millions of people's livelihoods kind of at stake here, especially since having a stimulus package go forward has nothing whatsoever to do with the thinking about how to rework the financial system that Jeremy Stein and Tim Geithner and company in Washington, who are now on point, are doing. And if we did not pass the stimulus package and did not boost federal spending over the next 18 months, that wouldn't help deal with the financial problems at all.
Let me just interrupt at this point and say, why don't we go to the Davis faculty and take some questions from then, and then you'll get a chance to sum up at the end. So I think first we have Katie Russ, and if you want to come up and just, would you declare whether you're a macroeconomist or not?
Oh, God, I'm having flashbacks to the job market all of a sudden. So I'm not sure if I classify as a macroeconomist. I was educated by a general equilibrium macro theorist, Thomas Levick, so I think I probably would fall into that category. So I felt really enriched by your interview, Professor Boldrin, on NPR yesterday when you were espousing a cleansing of the financial system as the key to unleashing private investment. And I saw that echoed in your description of the disease and what needs to be done to take care of the disease and cure the U.S. economy. But because I'm an international person, I'm also a really close observer of East Asian economies. And I noticed in the late 1990s, all of the countries that were afflicted by the East Asian crises, they also had these enormous real estate booms, busts, weakening of the banking systems, all of this predating their, the official date of their crises. And what I noticed is that all of these countries, whether or not they reorganized their financial systems and restructured according to IMF dictum and all of this, they recovered equally fast or slow. And so I'm wondering what evidence whatsoever there might be, that fixing the financial system will actually promote economic recovery. So I saw your slide saying that fiscal spending will not promote economic recovery, at least not very quickly. But do we have any evidence that actually cleansing the financial system in any way could do that either?
Is the rule that we answer right away? Sure. Yeah, I think we do. In fact, the cases you mentioned, you should specify a bit, because it seems to me that that's exactly what happened in those countries. The example of Japan being the most clear. Japan, in some sense, experienced something similar to what we are experiencing now, only a lot smaller, unfortunately for us now, and went through exactly the same motion we are, with substantial fiscal spending for a number of years, and with an attitude which is exactly the one Brad is giving us tonight. There are these good guys in Washington, my buddies, they're in charge. They're taking care of the financial system eventually, which meant that we all kept criticizing. The thing I find fascinating...
Jeremy Stein was extremely mean to me on my last paper. I'm not sure he counts as a buddy.
Take it easy, relax. So it was this keeping the banks alive. We should get into that for reasons that have to do part with convenience, part with personal relation, part with a certain view of the world, part for fear. And so on. But in any case, the banking system was kept alive in a kind of zombie state for years, becoming completely ineffective until eventually, toward the around 99, 2001, a number of banks were left fail, were cleaned up. Government intervention in the banking system became more serious and more precise. And some of the banks actually, at the cost of very long stagnation of about 8 years, managed to digest what we now call the toxic assets by themselves, and Japan started growing. The Swedish experience of the banking crisis is completely analogous to that. And in fact, in the case of Sweden, many of us is brought as an example. In the case of Sweden, the government of Sweden decided to act much more rapidly. And in fact, they did get out of the crisis much faster. So it seems to me the same applies. A very good example has been brought to my attention by Tim Keogh recently and another Spanish colleague in comparing the banking crisis of Chile in 1982-86 versus the one in Mexico. Chile did exactly what the bad guys like me are now suggesting: took over the banks, cleaned them up rapidly, kicking the butts of those in right away, move it over to a different management. That's absolutely crucial. We should go back to that. This idea of keeping the same guys in charge is a very bad idea. There is no shortage of good bankers around. That might be a good way of increasing employment and reducing unemployment in certain areas. And Chile, after the banking crisis, thanks partly to the work of my friend Rolf Luders, who was actually so serious at doing that he passed legislation that got he himself in jail for his past activity as a banker. Rolf is a funny, interesting character. Chile started an economic growth process that has been continuing for 25 years. Mexico did, again, what we're doing. And guess what? It's been stagnating ever since. I mean, the number of examples actually can continue pretty much ad libitum. So I think there is overwhelming historical evidence that when you're facing a major credit crunch generated by a banking crisis, either you clean up in a way or another the banks urgently, and you address that problem first and foremost, and you focus on that, the attention of the public, and you find the political support to do that, and you don't spend your public capital in building empty school building in Milwaukee, then you fix the problem. If instead you say, well, you take it easy, we'll do it on the background. We've been doing on the background for 2 years, and we are nowhere. That's the problem. We've been doing it for 2 years, and we are nowhere.
Let me just let Katie have a response to that, and then Brad, I'll give you a chance.
Sorry, Greg offered us one follow-up, so I'll just follow up. So Japan, I think you're really generous in saying that it started growing after 15 years of banking reform, because I remember, for instance, asset prices increased by 0.1%, and people were very excited. That was just 2 years ago. And also, Japan's banks right now are in better shape than banks in most of the Western world, and they still had manufacturing output contraction of about 12%, I believe, last quarter. And the specific East Asian countries I'm talking about would be Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, South Korea. All of these countries had crises at the same time. Some of them reorganized their banking systems quickly, some didn't. And the ones
Which one didn't? and grew faster. Certainly not Korea.
Malaysia. Malaysia actually didn't refuse to reorganize its financial sector, and it actually recovered at least as quickly, if not more quickly, than Indonesia, Thailand, countries that exercised fiscal austerity. So,
No, don't confuse the two things. Malaysia refused to implement the IMF recipes. It's very different from not fixing the bank. Malaysia took over its bank, which was almost all state banks in any case. Let's not confuse one thing with another. The IMF quick recipe of fiscal austerity is one thing. Taking care of the financial system is a different. Let's not mix the two things. Otherwise, we really are talking cross purposes. Japan grew at rates that for a demographically stagnant country like Japan are decent on the order of 2-3% in the early part of this century, and now has been growing into recession together with the rest of the world. I don't think that the fact that now Japan is going into recession, like as far as I can tell, pretty much every industrialized country I'm aware of, has any connection with the previous events. So I am not sure I understand the causality you're building up.
Okay, let's have a quick comment on that from Brad, and then we'll move on.
Sorry, just to clarify, I'm not trying to say that we should raise taxes and doing some IMF thing of raising taxes and cutting spending, you understand? That's almost as crazy or even more crazy than the fiscal stimulus.
Yeah, if I've wandered into some alternate universe in which we're here discussing reforming and re-regulating the financial system, let me say that I want the we should do what Sweden did position. Because I have been yelling at people to do the Swedish thing, what I now call the Akerlof-Brozens plan, for at least a year and a half as the right way to fix the financial system. But this is supposed to be about the stimulus package. And as far as I can see, the entire logical structure of the argument is that because we should long ago have taken the Swedish model as our model in dealing with the financial system, we should not attempt to reduce unemployment by doing a fiscal stimulus package. Okay, which has the logical structure of because asparagus is part of a healthy diet, you shouldn't eat fruit. Okay. It makes no sense at all.
Well,
it's totally separate. It's orthogonal.
You owe me one, so I have a credit of one, so I'm going to use half of it. Now, that's not. So let's do the Swedish example completely. Let's do the banking. And I remind you, Sweden actually went. There are plenty of papers, some of them from your friends, Keynesians, Chavazzi and Pagano, and the other European. Sweden practiced fiscal austerity in the sense you mean. That is, they did no fiscal stimulus. They actually cut some of their spending in a selective way. They try to build up efficiency, okay, and cut some of the taxes, which is why there is an abundant literature by European Keynesians talking about anti-Keynesian or non-Keynesian or whatever they call them paradoxes based exactly on that experience, on the experience of Sweden. So if you want that to suggest that we should do Sweden, I'm perfectly happy. Let's do asparagi and eggs.
Okay, hold there, because we actually do have the Swedish model here. So Pontus Rendahl, I believe, is the first macroeconomist we're going to hear from tonight.
I know you would say that. Yes, I confess I'm a macroeconomist.
That's okay, you can recover.
Okay. And I'm going to have two questions. I'm going to have one to Professor Boldrin, and I'm going to have one to Professor DeLong. First, oh, you can't hear me? I'm too tall.
You're too tall.
Okay, so first of all, I'm very sympathetic to Michele's view that part of the GMP is thought up. And there is a sort of a correction that has been taking place, and that has been painful. But there also seems to be some sort of drop in demand. Firms can't borrow to invest. Consumers postpone purchases of durables. So there seems to be some additional crash. And I'm just having this hypothetical, as a macroeconomist, a hypothetical thought experiment. Suppose we all agreed that the social value of buying 50 new hospitals or 10 bridges in the next 3 years is higher than the social cost. So that's something we wish to do. From a, 3-period horizon, the government's budget would still be balanced or unchanged if we bought those hospitals or bridges now, right? If there is some sort of slack in the economy currently, if there are idle capacity, idle workers in any of these sectors that build hospitals or bridges, we would get those bridges for a bargain. Okay? And in particular, if there's slack now, but there's no slack in 3 years. Because when we don't build that bridge we were supposed to build in 3 years, well, the private sector will build it because the economy is tight again. So I'm wondering, why would you oppose such an idea? We would still gain this social value that would exceed the social cost, and we also have the possibility of getting some oomph from this additional spending.
I don't. In fact,
Right.
if Brad had been, I don't, and given that Brad is covering his eyes, it's, oh my God, what is he coming up with? This guy is a clown. He's inventing things all the time. Let me actually try to find. This was the first draft. I'm trying to find my Denver Post article, because actually this is the first version. I'm trying to find the real version because we actually wrote it. It's explicitly written. We say, look, there are two ways of looking at the spending. One, I think I have it in mine, version on the blog, so let me go here. Is there a case for public borrowing now to finance a stimulus package, we ask? The first one says, people are worried about the future, we're all poorer, blah, blah, blah. The government is poorer as well. Put it that way, that's a non-starter. On the other hand, we say, government borrowing is cheap right now, and labor costs relatively low. If we accept this logic, then we reach an interesting conclusion. The additional spending now should be offset by less spending in the future. So we have nothing against that argument. So if that argument, we do it right, and we're going to pinpoint the right goods we want to produce, we want to borrow to produce them because the government can de facto now borrow cheap, and there is some unused capacity somewhere, not some generic used capacity, but not the pork decided by Republican Democrat congressmen, but the actual unused capacity, I have no objection whatsoever. But then we also have to write in the spending bill that we're playing an intertemporal trade-off. The later on, when the cost of borrowing for government will go up, when there will be no longer idle or unused capacity and so on and so forth, we'll cut down the spending. I have no objection. I wrote it. So if that's the point, I'm with you. Point is, that's not the spending bill we have. I'm sorry.
But it is. Right?
No, it isn't, Chief. No.
Back at the start of January.
No. Come on.
Start of January, as part of the initial
bet $1
negotiations,
million they won't cut spending?
in the initial negotiations for the spending bill, Obama said, I want to have a stimulus package now, and in return for a stimulus package now, I want the restoration of the pay-as-you-go rules that served as effective budget discipline during the Clinton years of the 1990s in the future after the recession.
That means he's going to raise my taxes. I want him to say, I'm going to cut the spending. It's very different. It's very different. It's the different thing. Let's not play games with words.
No,
it's a very different thing.
There are two questions. One question is, what's the long-term size of the government going to be? And that's a left-right political disagreement. The second question is, given the long-run size of the government, fix that. Should we be spending more and taxing less now to try to deal with this collapse of unemployment? Or this collapse of employment and this sudden rise in the unemployment rate? To say that because Obama wants a larger government in the long run than you do, that we shouldn't tilt the government's spending and tax plans in such a way as to run a big deficit now and a surplus later, that's just not right, right? I mean, Obama thinks the government should be larger than you do, yes. But the fact that Obama thinks the government should be larger than you do is not a reason for you to oppose stimulus now. When stimulus now, in Obama's mind, explicitly means a bigger deficit now and more budget discipline in the future. He gave you what you're now saying you want as part of the deal for getting unanimity among the Democratic senatorial caucus. And you don't seem to have noticed.
You remind me of those guys in Italy that when the day before going on the sale and putting up the discount, mark up their prices 25%, and then they put a 20% discount. So if that's the game we're playing, that's fine. You win. You win either way.
Yeah,
My statement was pretty clear in answer to Pontus' question. And as I said, we can write those rules clearly. If the game now has become, look, right now I agree with you, we're going to do the intertemporal trade-off. It just happens to be the case that I had planned in any case to increase government spending of about 20% in the future, so sorry, tough luck, I won't cut it in any case. then I'm not, it doesn't work anymore. It doesn't add up.
Once again, have I gone into an alternate world where we're debating whether the size of the U.S. federal government should be 16% of GDP or 25% of GDP? Because if that's the world we're in, I'll be happy to take the 25% side, but I want to start over. Right.
Let's go back
supposed to be about the stimulus package.
Pontus, who I think may have a question for Brad.
Okay, so I have a second question here for Professor DeLong. So as I previously noted, we have this fall in private investment due to the lack of credit. We have a fall in the purchases of durables due to postponement or out of fear of consumers. And it seems like with some rigidities in the economy, that this doesn't really translate to lower wages, but rather to higher unemployment. Mm-hmm. So there is some sort of slackness in the economy. But it seems like this slackness should be reflected in prices. And it seems like there is a fall in private demand, and it seems like your suggestion is to replace this fall with government demand. But the composition of these two demands, and I know Professor Boldrin spoke about this before, might not be the same. We have fall in the purchases of flat-screen TVs and SUVs, but if the government buys hospitals, what good is that if there's no slackness in the construction sector, for instance? So the question is, suppose that if slackness is reflected in prices, cutting taxes for individuals and cutting taxes for firms frees up resources, and these resources will chase the cheap prices which are targeted at the slack sectors in the economy. Wouldn't we get then more efficiency out of our policy by using the pricing system to allocate these free resources? And in addition, my second question to that is, wouldn't
That's a third question.
But that's okay. And the second question is, wouldn't also taxes reduce wedges or distortions in the economy that also additionally would help us? So if we lower tax rates and not only taxes.
Well, I think that this is the reason why the Obama stimulus package is one-third tax cuts. Right? That argument has force. And that to the extent that you can boost demand in the short run through tax cuts and thus get people focusing on where there are efficient opportunities for them to maintain or increase their consumption because prices have declined, that's a good thing, right? And a significant advantage in a stimulus program. I think that the reason why I think about that's one-third of the stimulus package. Another one-third of the stimulus package is simply dealing with the consequences of federalism. That is the fact that because individual states and localities and others have balanced budget requirements year by year, the state of California is now cutting back its own spending at a ferocious and a horrendous rate. And at least the last set of numbers I saw, another third of the stimulus package was essentially giving the states money to maintain their kind of current efforts to keep the states from actually cutting their own demand in this crisis, which leaves only the remaining third of the stimulus package plus things that are really not stimulus at all, like the alternative minimum tax patch added to get Republican Senators Snowe and Collins and Specter on board, that the remaining third of it is spending. And it's pretty clear to me that almost all of that spending is on places where there is substantial slack of unused resources to be brought up. And it seems that an internal solution is a wholly reasonable thing to do, right, in designing this package.
Thanks, Brad. So next we have Alan Taylor of the Department of Economics, who may be a macroeconomist.
I'm going to take the fifth.
He's a trade economist.
Could I ask my follow-up question first, which is like a clarification, and then ask my long question?
Yes.
So I'm also struck that there's agreement on the panel, not just that most macroeconomics is a load of nonsense, and I'll come back to that, but also that stimulus works. So particularly, Michele liked Pontus's argument about spending on hospitals when there's slack, and Michele also cited, seemingly with approval, the Mountford-Uhlig study, where the multiplier, he said, was only 1. But I thought, Michele, you were here to argue that it was 0.
Well, it depends. Are you looking at the gross or the net? one
gross.
One, yeah, right. So, 0 for the gross is kind of complicated. 1 is low enough.
0 for the gross is where Cochrane and Barrow and the other signatories to the Cato letter are.
Am I responsible of everything that a
You
person that
signed
signs?
it.
But I didn't sign their paper. I signed what was written in that statement. Come on, Brad, don't be ridiculous. I mean, the moment in which I sign something with Robert Barrow, I can't possibly sign all his regression to the mean regression.
Michele,
Which I've criticized in writing. Give me a break. I'm not signing into the life of the guy. I'm signing that precise statement. Nothing more.
So just to clarify, Michele, are you a 1 or are you a 0?
You get out what you put in. That's my multiplier. Is that okay? Plus, if you add a few inefficiencies, I'm probably on a 0.96.
Okay, let me see if I can get out more than I put in on the next question. Okay, so modern macroeconomics in grad schools and in our journals and on the conference circuit is built on a series of modeling assumptions. And for the people who are not familiar with this strange zoo, let me list some of them. Representative agents, rational expectations, flexible prices, flexible wages, no unemployment of labor, no underutilization of capital, the neutrality of money, the irrelevance of many other policies. And then in terms of assumptions about finance, we could add complete financial markets, the efficient markets hypothesis, no states of the world without funding liquidity, and with that no credit constraints, and as a corollary, Ricardian equivalence, no states of the world without market liquidity, no frictions, no asymmetric information, and I'll stop there. Now, understandably, this intellectual framework has come in for a bit of criticism recently. It was described. This kind of thing has been described in the New York Times blog by Paul Krugman as the dark ages of macroeconomics. And Willem Buiter.
Models like that. What is he talking about?
Okay. Yeah. Willem Buiter, writing on his blog yesterday, criticized both new classicals and new Keynesians for going down this path. He says, and I quote, "The typical graduate macroeconomics and monetary economics training received at Anglo-American universities during the past 30 years may have set back by decades serious investigations of aggregate economic behavior and economic policy-relevant understanding. It was a privately and socially costly waste of time and other resources." And I know you agree with this, Greg. Most mainstream macroeconomic theoretical innovations since the 1970s, the new classical rational expectations revolution associated with such names as Lucas, Prescott, Sargent, Barrow, etc., and the new Keynesian theorizing of Woodford and many others, have turned out to be self-referential, inward-looking distractions at best. Research tended to be motivated by the internal logic, intellectual sunk capital, and aesthetic puzzles of established research programs rather than by a powerful desire to understand how the economy works, let alone how the economy works during times of stress and financial instability. So the economics profession was caught unprepared when the crisis struck. So I'd like to ask you, where do you stand on all this? Do any of your policy recommendations and understandings of this crisis depend on these models? And as for our future research, what the heck should we be doing?
You asking me?
Both of you.
Well, let me just say yes.
Yeah.
And
I sign in.
Let me say that in trying to deal with the economy over the past year and a half, the only things in my education that are useful were the lectures of Charlie Kindleberger about manias, on his book Manias, Panics, and Crises, and the lectures of Barry Eichengreen on the history of the Bank of England and its slow evolution of its stabilization policy role, and that nothing else has been any help at all.
I'm less sanguine than Brad, but I'm not so far away. So I think Willem Buiter there has a little bit of what you say,
shrillness,
sour grapes.
Yes.
Is that the way you call it?
Yes.
Maybe because he got a few papers too many rejected by one of those guys. But leaving personal issues aside, I think that is not so off the mark. A couple of years ago, when this whole charade started, I wrote a piece, and I regret so much that I hadn't translated it in English on my blog. It had a little bit of resonance around Italy because it was on the misery of macroeconomics, in which I guess I was saying exactly what Professor Buiter said yesterday or the day before on the Financial Times. Tough luck, I didn't think to write it in English and put it on Financial Times. I would have got better press. So, yeah, I wouldn't be so sanguine in the sense that it's too easy to dismiss good research that is also relevant when it doesn't apply at the problem at hand. There is stuff from that literature, we have learned a number of things. If you want, we can go through them now, but we'll get a bit technical. But it's certainly the case that at a certain point, and I agree, it's become seriously self-referential, and this applies to both. In my humble opinion, it's even more self-referential in the new Keynesian thing because of the way in which it has evolved. It seems to be an area of research in which people start with a conclusion, and the conclusion is always and obsessively the same. Money matters. You know, if I put liquidity, we got to get employment going through the roof. So that's the conclusion. The central bank, they are the ever-powerful guys. In fact, I consider them intellectually. And again, it's not a personal matter. These are social phenomena responsible of the build-up of this, one of the most absurd myths of the world for the last 20 years, the ever-powerful master of the universe, from Mr. Greenspan onward, right? It's this absolute insane myth that Greenspan moves some levers somewhere and miracles happen and we all become rich. Paranoia. Absolute, total paranoia, in my opinion. So that whole literature seems to be motivated by that. The real business cycle, or whatever you want to call it, literature, has become religious because once they hit a point, which I think they hit a point at the beginning, which was, look, technology shocks, changes in productivity due to, call them natural or technological reasons, do play a role in business cycle, and we ought to study them because they have explanatory power. They turned that thing from an interesting research hypothesis into a religious commandment, and then the model shrunk. You know, you ask my student, I always poke fun in the first year class at the word is not log utility, representative agent, Cobb-Douglas production function. I hate them all, and I refuse to use them. But yes, overall it's correct, which is a reason why I also have a very sanguine attitude toward people that think they have the fix in their pocket right away. That's why I disagree with Brad and the people that insist that the thing we ought to do is the fiscal stimulus, blah, 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 for the reason he said no, because we don't have evidence in theory and in the empirics supporting that. And while he keeps insisting that it's okay, let's do it, it's the emergency thing, we have to do something while we think of the real problem, I insist it's not true. The political debate doesn't work that way. That's the point. The political debate works by focusing public opinion attention on issues and acts. And in the moment in which you convince them, like Bush did with his silly $400, whatever it was, tax rebate, that you're doing something, then people don't pay attention to the serious problem. The serious problem go under the rug. So it's not true, Brad. Let me insist on this because I think it's the most important thing that as an academic I feel like saying. It's not true. Even if I may agree in single specific pieces and bits and pieces of the stimulus plan, that I should say yes to that approach because we have to do something in the meanwhile that we think at the bank. No, 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 no. That distorts the attention of the public opinion. We have to focus the public opinion on the banking sector, on the financial crisis, on the things that cause it, on the bad regulation, and so on and so forth. We have to focus the political attention on that because either we solve the problem as soon as possible, and every week that passes, every month that passes, it's worse, or 6 months from now, you and I are going to be at some other nice place having the same ridiculous debate, and you're going to tell me, Michele, but look, unemployment's gone 12%, we got to do something. And I'm going to tell you, oh, but, you know, Citibank, we gave them last other 50 billions. You know what I mean?
Thank you. Next we have Kevin Salyer, and I just want to ask that if we can ask a question without a 400-yard run-up, that would be helpful because we're going to run out of time very soon, and I'd like to get a few questions at least from the people who are not technical economists.
My name is Kevin. I'm a macroeconomist. Forget about the current situation. Forget about the current situation. Let's think of the previous 25 years, right? Because obviously the current situation is a mess, right? And we can't get too much agreement here. So over the last 25 years, from 82 to 2007, that 25 years, real GDP doubled. We had two very mild and very short recessions during that time. We had the longest expansion in history. Inflation went from 6.2% to 2.8%. The unemployment rate went from 9.7% to 4.6%. That's a pretty good record, right? I think you can look at that 25 years was an outstanding economic performance. So, do you think, and I know the answer to this, do you think macroeconomic research should get some credit for those achievements? And if so, it is a beautiful world. You guys all look alike to me. Anyway, and if so, shouldn't we build on that theory to confront the current downturn? That's a question to both of you. Thank you. Brad first.
I think that macroeconomic theory played somewhat of a role in helping the 25 years until July 2007 from being, or making them relatively peaceful, placid, in a time of relatively rapid growth and low inflation. I think that research in finance, by contrast, played a substantial role in setting us up for the current crash. So if we are allowed to divide the world into macroeconomists and finance economists, we can say, kind of like they did in Animal Farm, right? Macroeconomists, okay. Finance economists, not so okay, especially not the continuous trading and the Gaussian, right, the Gaussian diffusion assumptions, not so okay at all.
Thank you. Michele.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I can add further jokes, but basically I tend to agree.
So our last question here is actually Eric Rauchway from the History Department. And Eric.
Not only am I not a macroeconomist, I have never been a macroeconomist.
But overthrowing the government of the United States by force and violence?
I'm not the one on trial here, Brad.
Oh, we are.
Historians don't do models. We just have information. And this discussion has prompted me to have a lot of information racketing around in my head, especially about the U.S. Capacity to borrow to employ people, especially in its major wars, such as the Civil War, World War I, and especially World War II. And it's worth noting that on these occasions, the United States government is very good at making use of a labor force, which often include lots of men with hairy hands who became nurses, like Ernest Hemingway and Walt Whitman, who had no trouble performing those duties. We're much more flexible, us hairy-handed guys, than you may think. This is really a long-winded way of getting around to say we're often led to believe that the fiscal stimulus provided by World War II ended the Great Depression because the United States government borrowed and spent a lot more money than it ever had during the New Deal, and that therefore, if the United States had spent that amount of money earlier in the 1930s, that the Great Depression would have ended sooner. So my question, and I'll give you my follow-up also, is when did the Great Depression end and why?
Michele.
Well, I don't know the answer to the last question. I wasn't around. So, no, let me, in order to try to answer your question, people may have noticed it's great to have debates. From now on, every serious debate should be done with people having their laptop and wireless. Because I'm going to ask a question, and this is not just to be polemical to Brad. Is this the paper by Remy you mentioned before, showing the big multiplier? The summary I get here, which is Susan Woodward and Bob Hall blog, say Valerie Ramin has written a paper. Let's open it in a tab. Oops, shoot. Sorry. Well, I'm going to get to your question. To the extent I'm able, I'm going to get to your question. With the results of a recent work on the question and with a full bibliography, blah, 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 her answer is that consumption and other categories stay about the same when the government spends more. I don't see any multiplier. So the answer here is 1-to-1. Government spending goes up 1, the output goes up 1, which is what I said before when I said 0.96. So to go back to your question, really the counterfactual you ask, I don't know how to do it. The only thing I can do is I do find some of the research of Leo Hanian and Al Cole on that matter interesting, not necessarily convincing, but interesting with my reading of the history of that time. And their answer to your question, to the extent I believe it, let's put it 0.7, between 0 and 1 is no, it would not have ended earlier. Now, you also know the answer actually to your question when we look at the data. When the big depression ended, it depends how you define it. If you define it as going back to trend, you know you have to wait for the end of the World War. If you define it by growth rate going from negative to positive, you know that that's roughly around 33, 34, but then there is a drop in 35, and it takes a long while to go back to trend. more than that, I think if one has to be intellectually honest, cannot really say, and I think you knew it before asking the question. Again, all the evidence we have in terms of the counterfactual the federal government spent much more back then, would have the depression been avoided or be much shorter. All I can say is what I said before. There is no evidence for the multiplier to be larger than 1. Therefore, the answer will be no. It would not have ended earlier. And also, let's try to this may open another myth. Let's try to stop. Mr. Hoover was not my friend, nor I have any relation with his family and descendants. But this mythology that Hoover was some laissez-faire fiscal paranoid that didn't do any public spending is completely false. Morgenthau, if I'm not correct, was the Treasury Secretary for Roosevelt most of the time, has in Britain repeatedly argued that pretty much all they used to do for the New Deal was to take Hoover legislation, amplify it a bit. So the amount of federal spending he put in was substantial. You can say, well, it was not enough. So taking a kind of Krugman approach, 1 trillion is not enough, we need 3. Sure, again, counterfactual are very hard to do in history, but this mythology that there was no federal spending, no public spending between 1929 and 1933 when Roosevelt came to power is just mythology. So we should actually look at the scene properly. There was substantial increase in federal spending during that period, and it had absolutely no effect.
Increases in federal tax rates as well,
on the rich,
which Hoover thought he had no choice but to do, largely because of pressure from Andrew Mellon, his Treasury Secretary and company. Hoover's judgment of his policies after the fact in his autobiography was explicitly that he ought to have spent a whole bunch more and worried significantly less about balancing the budget than he did, and that he was very ill-served by his subordinates. A very cranky man in his old age. As to the answer to Eric's question, right, the Great Depression ended in 1937, and then Roosevelt, Great Depression having ended, gave a sigh and said, I can abandon all of these emergency stimulus policy measures, and we can go back to what I've always believed, which is tight money and balanced budgets. And as he did so, the economy fell off a cliff again. Into 1938 with another sudden big demand shock. And that what's happening from 1938 on is actually a second depression, called it Roosevelt returns to his kind of old balanced budget self-recession, and is probably best not modeled as part of the Great Depression itself, right, which reaches its nadir in 1933, after which you have fairly rapid recovery. As to what would have happened had you done World War II-style government spending during the mid-1930s, well, there are enormous problems with extrapolations outside the range of the data. Right? You're drawing a straight line and you're extending it 4 times beyond any data points you have, and to the extent you then stand up and say you believe in that, well, you're very much like Wile E. Coyote having run out beyond the edge of the cliff and hoping it'll still sustain you. Nevertheless, right, countries did 3 things during the Great Depression. They ran balanced budgets or they ran substantial deficits. They kept their interest rates relatively high to maintain gold standard credibility, or they pumped money into their economy. They stuck as firmly as they could to their gold standard parities, if necessary imposing exchange controls, or they let their currencies float and fall. And along all 3 dimensions it looks, but the number of cases is not that great, as if whatever stimulative policies you did helped. If you let your currency devalue, as Sweden did after its 1992 crisis, in order to boost spending on its goods by importing it from abroad, that helped. If it pumped its own economy full of cash so that people had ample money balances that they then held some itch to spend, that helped. And to the extent that the government spent more than it took in, that helped as well. I think we have a much easier time with the counterfactual if we simply move World War II up 5 years. and say, suppose that World War II in Europe had started in 1934 rather than 1939, and the U.S. had gotten into it in 1936 rather than 1941, I think then the answer is pretty clearly yes, right? That the early coming of mobilization for war would certainly have pulled everyone out of the Depression much faster.
No, let me take it. No, I don't think. I think you're just. Well, it's fine, but this is a classical case in which hope is taking control of what you say over experience. You know, this is a graph. The graph I'm showing there is actually from the paper you quote approvingly. And it shows that the military spending effect in the United States, both in the Korean War and the Second World War, it's by Valerie Remy, is 1-on-1 on GNP. Yeah. You put in one, you get back one. That's her finding. So I don't see how. As for Europe, by the way, you understand, Italy, Germany, and so on were actually out of the Depression. They never got in for completely different reasons.
Well, Germany got in. Germany definitely
Germany got in earlier, Brad, and got out. Right. So it has nothing to do with the 29 Depression. It's a different.
Adolf Hitler and military spending. So I got out in the 1930s.
If you want to go through the economic history of Germany, that's fine. We can have the debate on that. But you certainly cannot use that argument in this instance for public spending and so on.
No,
you certainly
you cannot.
And you know that.
No, spending on concentration camp, building concentration
Don't
camps.
mix up dates. Come on.
That's not real change you can believe in.
Okay. Order. We have almost run.
Camp in 1932.
We have almost run out of time, but let's just take two questions from the audience to end up with. You have to come down to the microphone down here. Anyone who wants to ask a question, but down to the microphone that's here.
Oh, move the microphone otherwise.
Right.
It seems that one of the main goals of the stimulus package and ways of measuring success will be that unemployment goes down. But there are tons of people that can't retire because their wealth is diminished so much. So they stay in the workforce for a much longer time. And I haven't heard anybody talk about it or address how that's going to affect this whole thing, the measurement of it or the success of it. And I'd appreciate some comments on that.
That's a very interesting idea that I had not previously thought of. Although I had, in fact, thought of what the effects of the collapse of the stock market will be on retirement trends, right? I mean, this is quite an extraordinary thing to happen to stock market wealth, especially because this time it's not orthogonal to, it's very correlated to housing wealth as well. So anyone whose portfolio was at all in stocks and real estate and was at all defined contribution has now seen a major, major hit to the resources they thought they were going to support them in retirement. And so I'm going to ask your question to my old boss, Alicia Manel, who's now director of the Center for Retirement Research at Boston College, because she's the person who I think is best equipped to answer how will what's happened to portfolios change retirement age and affect the measured unemployment rate, especially as she's just announced that she's going to postponing her own retirement for 4 years.
Michele, any thoughts on this?
Well, I had thought about it, and yes, I think that that's a serious issue that people are not taking into consideration. I think it's already showing the data, in part in people behavior. One interesting thing I think we were mentioning today at lunch was you look at the data of unemployment and employment recently, you find this interesting phenomenon that contrary to all previous experience, older people age 50 or 55 and more, are actually increasing. The employment levels for that age group is increasing, whereas it's dropping dramatically for the younger people. So there's clearly a supply reaction in some form, a willingness of people to accept pay cuts, to modify their working habits, whatever, just to stay on the job when they're of older age. It also, and this is going to surprise Brad, I'm sure, again, assuming I'm some insane Republican economist that wanted total privatization of the pension system. This is a further proof of actually why that's a pretty bad idea. And I'm glad I wrote papers since the early 90s arguing that on the basis of theory. And here is an interesting thing. You know, let's say something for general equilibrium theory, for economic theory at work. I didn't get to that conclusion from some particular political thing. If you think for a moment seriously what a proper pension portfolio should be, in an ideal world in which you can actually invest in all kind of possible assets that generate income so that you have the perfectly diversified old age portfolio, you do realize that the so-called full capitalization portfolio is nothing but at most 35% of it. Because that's roughly, to make it really big, the share of national income that is produced by assets or attributed to assets that are quoted in one or the other, the financial market, the other 65, 70% coming from human capital, labor, and so on, which are, fortunately, not traded in any financial markets. Henceforth, if you want a really efficient and properly diversified portfolio, there's very basic general equilibrium theory that suggests, well, you want something like resembling the pay-as-you-go. If then the design of the pay-as-you-go, this is something this administration should take up seriously, not stimulus plan. This is a lot more stimulating, in my opinion, than stimulus plan. The design and the incentive system internal to our current social security are particularly bad, also for some of the reason, for some of the problem you were bringing up. So that's certainly, this may provide us with an opportunity to take up the incentive system implicit in the design of the social security thing. But it certainly, I hope, will put to rest forever this idea that the ideal pension system is a fully capitalized, 100% in the stock and financial market thing, and it's not something that economic theory suggests is good. That's the important thing to stress.
Thank you. We have time for one last question.
Retired, and I do a lot of stock investing now, and I had a few thoughts. One in particular, Obama stimulus seems to be... Use the mic. Hello, can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm retired and I invest, so I think a lot about all this sort of stuff, and the Obama stimulus seems to be that I've been reading figures of 10% or maybe 15% of the money is going to be spent in 2009, and that most of the money actually comes in later in 2010 and really in 2011. So it seems to be back-end loaded, and that's not going to help people out right today. Also, it seemed that a lot of that stuff, a good chunk of it was mentioned here, was backfill for helping the states out to do the unemployment and the Medicare and all the Medicaid and all that other sort of stuff. I think one thing that's been really missing in the program is the ability to start re-insulating people's houses and to look at energy. I think that one of the reasons that the credit bubble ultimately busted was because people are spending more and more, okay, and energy is getting more expensive as time went on. Finally, there was a pinch, okay, and that ultimately started it all. Do you have any thoughts about the speed of the reaction?
The last numbers that I saw were calculations by the Congressional Budget Office saying that 28% of the stimulus money was being spent in fiscal 2009, which is a government accounting period that ends on September 30th, 2009. Right? So in design, the intention was for the money to be spent fairly evenly over the next 2 years to the extent that they could. Right, ramping up programs as fast as they could, but no faster, so that they weren't trying to pull places where there were no workers, trying to spend money on places where there were no workers. So when you say 10% in 2009, it sounds like you've been listening a little too much to Fox News. Because that's not...
Come on, it might have looked a less, how can I say, Obama-prone estimates of
No,
the
these are the Congressional Budget Offices,
and
for
so?
God's sake.
And
the
so?
Congressional Budget Office
And
has...
so?
Good God.
I don't know.
Do you know anything about the American structure of government at all?
I actually do, and you're not going to convince me that the Congressional Budget Office doesn't fiddle with data like every other guy.
Yeah.
Right. Oh, she said that you can see in recovery.gov how quickly the money is being released.
Let me say that to trust nobody is as great an error as to trust everybody. That a great number of very good economists have spent their careers building up the nonpartisan authoritative chops of the Congressional Budget Office. I think they've done a very good job. And I don't think people who know nothing should be casually trashing a reputation as honest stewards of economic rationality that they have tried very hard, right, to build up. Okay, follow up.
The CBO's, as of this year,
yeah. Yeah.
It's over there.
Here,
Just move
here.
Come over.
Since we're talking about the CBO, the CBO's estimate for GDP for this year is minus 1.2%. That just sounds a little bit optimistic.
That's not a follow-up. That's the CBO's estimate was from a forecast made at the start of January, when I think that was a
Even then, I'd
reasonable.
say it
It
was
was
a
a
little bit
very
optimistic.
reasonable number for a year-over-year number.
Michele.
I'm not going to get into the debate if the Congressional Budget Office has a big or small confidence error. And,
Why not? You could go back.
No,
and
because it
look at
doesn't
its
seem.
past
It doesn't seem to
records.
be. The numbers
Its
are there.
forecast errors are unbiased, have been unbiased for 23 years. It regularly does retrospective evaluations of the extent to which. No, I actually have information here. It regularly does retrospective evaluations.
And I let
and
you
you do
exhibit your
not.
information, and we'll.
Hold on.
There is a
Diana,
way
you
of
do
figuring
not
out.
have
Let
Michele answer, please.
I'm not interested in that type of debate, in the sense that, you put your faith where you want to put it, and you put in that estimates because it pleases you. There's plenty of others. You don't have to go Fox News. Any number between 10 and 20% is fine. Problem is that even if it is 25%, it makes no difference, because the amount that we are talking about in the case is 25%. It's about a quarter of a little bit less than 800 billion, which probably 800 billion, which probably includes in that the part you don't like, which is the patch on the alternative minimum tax, which alone, if I'm not incorrect, is 80 billion. So that's about 10% already gone. So you understand that the actual money going in the thing that you like called spending is probably in the order of 10%, even under the Congressional Budget Office estimate. So in any case, we're talking numbers that are relatively small, and we're talking on a period of 12 months, whereas. Fine, 7 months, correct. I thought he was saying, well, okay, I think I got myself confused. So that's neither here nor there. But let me actually, given that I think I owe a little bit of I have a bit of a credit on time here. Let me, given the number of interruption, let me actually try to repeat and insist, because you keep evading the issue, and I have not heard a word from Brad on what you think we should do with the financial system.
Yes,
Why? No, you haven't. I would like to understand in what sense you believe we should keep trusting whatever is going on between the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department on the matter. Because, in fact, if there is something that concerns me seriously, is that. And it's not clear to me what the strategy either of the administration or the Federal Reserve is at this point, other than apparently this idea that the Federal Reserve is going to become the lender of first resort on pretty much anything, including my next purchase of an Aston Martin. I hope they'll finance it at a properly low rate. That actually is, in my opinion, a very serious concern. Finally, on the matter of doctrine, which apparently was the raison for this debate, let me actually say something. The way you keep describing this spending plan is very much analogous to what a rigid monetarist would say is monetary policy. What you have in mind is a situation similar to 1933, where 25% or 30% of the labor force is unemployed, where the price system is completely gone, markets have been de facto destroyed and are not operational anymore, and people are strictly idle and resources are strictly idle and abandoned because there is a lack of any form of even currency or instruments of credit in the market. At that point, what we essentially do, we don't do something. The way you describe it has nothing to do with the actual stimulus plan that we have that consists in transfer to state, the alternative minimum tax. What we do, we send a check home to every American household and say, go out and spend it, because there is a guy next door that is ready to cook your bread, fix your make your shoes, fix your roof, and so on and so forth. I think there is absolutely no doubt, and nobody's going to quarrel with that in a situation like that, the type of thing you keep calling a fiscal spending, which is nothing but a monetary injection directly in the checking account of the household, would probably work. I don't think there is any debate on that. I don't think any, straight-thinking economist would disagree with that. But the problem is that that's a fantasy. That's or a nightmare. We are not in that situation, thanks Lord, for now. Hopefully we will not get into that situation. We are not living in a country where there is homogeneous, almost uniform 30% unemployment rate across the country, and plants that are perfectly operational and for which there would be potential demand working and so on and so forth. That's not the situation. If that was the situation, that was the target we wanted to reach, they should have done what my friend Sandro Brusco suggested to me 2 years ago. He said, tell your buddy Bernanke, he assumes he's my buddy because I met him 3 or 4 times, to just print a $20,000 check and deposit in the current checking account of every household family in the United States, a total of $2 trillion roughly, and that will do, and we're over with. But that's neither the situation we're in, nor what has been done. What has been done is a different thing, and we should judge it by its proper merit. And I insist in particular, and I finish, we should stop pretending and doing this propaganda that this is the solution when we know that the problem is sitting somewhere else.
That's a great summary, I think, of Michele's position. I'm just going to turn over to Brad, and for 3 minutes, why don't you summarize your...
Well, I'm still wondering who the people are who are proclaiming that the stimulus package is the solution to the financial market problems, rather than the bandage we apply to the economy to keep unemployment from getting that much higher, while we try to work out what I have for a year now been saying ought to be an attempt to reproduce the Swedish model. That is, nationalize the 10 biggest banks, break them up, reprivatize their parts over the next 3 or 4 years. In the meantime, try to make sure that lending to businesses that ought to be expanding kind of keeps on going. And 2.5 years ago, the underemployment rate in the U.S. economy, was 6%. That if you took those who were unemployed and those who said they weren't in the labor force because they didn't think they could find a job, and those who were working part-time but said they really wanted a full-time job but couldn't find one, that was 6% of the economy. Now, if you go looking for this U6 underemployment rate, you see it's up there at 16%, or going to be 16% come this Friday, when we're going to get another horrible unemployment number as the results of the mid-February Consumer Current Population Survey are released. Now, 16% isn't 25%, but it's a lot of the way from the normal 6% up to 25%. Depression economics is unfortunately coming back into relevance as demand falls and as the unemployment rate and underemployment rate in the economy rise. And to the extent that we have a theory that you think is adequate for 1933, when the underemployment rate was on the order of 25%, it should be at least half relevant to 2009, when the rate is up at 16%.
Thank you. I need to end with some thanks. I want to thank IGA for doing the organizing for this event, and Jean Stratford and Mary Davis in particular. I want to thank the Levine Family Foundation for providing some of the financing to enable this, and that we're very grateful. Of course, as department chair, I'm now going to be turning my thoughts to what we can convert hairy-handed macroeconomists into some kind of useful employment.
Try a fiscal stimulus.
But last of all, I want to give a very big thanks both to Brad and to Michele for what I think was a fascinating and spirited debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great job. Very good. Thank you. All right. So, very nice. I hadn't seen the screen.
The preceding program was brought to you by UC Davis on iTunes U. Please visit us at itunes.ucdavis.edu.